us to pack up our bags and head south. They said that the luck of the Irish ran out. They told us they burned down our farms and our stores. They cursed us for cowards and our wives for whores.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to Truth on the Tracks. I'm Brandon Turbeville, your host. For those of you who are just joining us tonight here for the first time, I'd like to remind you that you can catch Truth on the Tracks here every Monday night and Friday night at 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time here on UCY.TV. The original broadcast, the new broadcast, is on Monday night. The rebroadcast is on Friday night. You can catch the show's personal webpage at ucy.tv/TT for Truth on the Tracks. And on that page, you'll find the chat room, you'll find the RSS feed to my articles that traces back to BrandonTurbeville.com, and you'll find the archive versions of this show and related news there on that webpage. I am also, for those of you, again, who are just joining for the first time and don't know who I am a staff writer for ActivistPost.com. I also write for the antimedia.org, progressivegazette.com, and my own website is BrandonTurbeville.com. So if you're interested in my work specifically, then I would encourage you to go to BrandonTurbeville.com. Check out the information that I have there. That's the website where I repost all of my articles, all of the rebroadcast versions of this show, the archive versions of this show, the YouTube videos, the interviews, and all of the other relevant information. I've got 6 books out as well, and you can find those at BrandonTurbeville.com under the Books tab. You can also find out ways to contact me if you so desire, to send hate mail or love mail or whatever you want to send. So all that is up there at BrandonTurbeville.com. So we're going to talk about several different topics tonight, and hopefully these things are seamlessly transitioning here. And it should be, because they're all interrelated to begin with. And I guess we should start with the fake leaflets that were dispersed in Ukraine, in Donetsk, Ukraine, the eastern part of Ukraine. And these leaflets were allegedly telling Jews that they had to register themselves and their personal wealth with the state or be deported. And of course, we know that that's fake now. We're also going to talk about the claims against Assad for yet another chemical weapons attack. We're going to talk briefly about the history and science of color revolutions. Then I want to talk about Rand Paul. So I hope you understand where this is going. We're going to start with the international front. We're going to discuss some incidents and issues that have taken place in Ukraine. Move to Syria, talk about color revolutions, and since we're talking about color revolutions, or at least the relevant part of that discussion being deception, then we'll talk about Rand Paul, Little Rand, and then we'll get into some other areas of concern that I have for the alternative media, the activist communities, and other communities that unfortunately are being led astray. But let's get to Ukraine. So what we had, this relates to an article that I wrote on April the 18th. So this goes back a ways. More propaganda, fake leaflets telling Jews to register or be deported. So essentially, what this is that the leaflets were distributed in Donetsk, and it's claiming to require Jews to register with the People's Republic of Donetsk. And the People's Republic of Donetsk is this pro-Russian militia, activist, and so forth that had taken over Donetsk and had created their own parallel government, pro-Russian parallel government. The leaflets were given to Jews who were exiting a synagogue by men who were wearing balaclavas and Russian flags. That's obvious, not obvious enough, I guess, for some people. And they informed them that they had to register themselves and a list of their property, as well as they had to pay a registration fee, or they'd face deportation, have their citizenship revoked, have their belongings confiscated, and so forth. Here's what the leaflet says, according to USA Today. It says, Dear Ukraine citizens of Jewish nationality, and it states that all people of Jewish descent over 16 years old must report to the Commissioner for Nationalities in the Donetsk Regional Administration Building and register. It says the reason is because the leaders of the Jewish community of Ukraine, get this, supported Binduri Junta, a reference to Stefan Bandera, the leader of the Ukrainian nationalist movement that fought for Ukrainian independence at the end of World War II. And, of course, let me stop this discussion right here to point out that Stefan Bandera, how ridiculous this assumption is and these claims are that Stefan Bandera, that the Jews were supporting him. Bandera was a Nazi. Bandera fought for Hitler. Bandera led pogroms against Jews in Ukraine. So why in the hell would the Jews support Bandera? They don't. In fact, there aren't any, to my knowledge, Jewish supporters of the Euromaidan for this reason, because the Euromaidan protesters and the activists and the brown shirts are fascists. They're Nazis. They are anti-Semites, clearly. So this is just beyond belief. But it also said the Jews had to register because they opposed the pro-Slavic People's Republic of Donetsk. The leaflet described documents that the Jews would have to provide. This ID and passport are required to register your Jewish religion, religious documents of family members, as well as documents establishing the rights to all real estate property that belongs to you, including vehicles. That's what it says. Consequences for non-compliance results in citizenship being revoked and, quote, you will be forced outside the country with the confiscation of property. Registration fee was about $50, it said. But of course, as soon as this propaganda came out, reports came from the mainstream media, left and right, NPR, Fox, CNN, all of them went crazy. The pro-Russian militants hate Jews. Of course, these mainstream outlets largely ignored the fact that the Euromaidan fascists hated Jews openly. They didn't report on that, but they had no problem reporting on this fake leaflet. John Kerry, Skull and Bones Kerry, latched on to it to drum up war propaganda against the pro-Russian separatists, and of course he brought up the images of Nazi Germany and so forth only a few months after he played the Hitler card against Assad in Syria. So this is what Kerry said in response. In the year 2014, after all of the miles traveled and all of the journey of history, this is not just intolerable, it's grotesque. And any of the people who engage in these kinds of activities, from whatever party or whatever ideology or whatever place they crawl out of, there is no such place for that. Well, guess what, John Kerry? I'm sure you know this already, but whatever party and whatever ideology, whatever place they crawl out of, is the U.S. State Department. Congratulations, you are that rock. You are that party. You are that ideology, because you funded these fascists and these anti-Semites. U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine, Jeffrey Piot, also seized on these reports. He actually came out and committed himself and said these are the real deal. Of course, Zionist organizations all across the world, they seized on these reports as well. But these things were blamed on the chairman of Donetsk temporary government, Denis Pushilin. This guy denies that he had anything to do with them. But what we can tell here is that these things are fake, right? Deputy Director of the National Conference Supporting Jews, Leslie Weiss, told the Daily Dot, and this is a quote, "It's a fake flyer. It's not true that they have to register or be deported," end quote. So in other words, they're absolutely made up. And look at the ideology that they're pushing here, the ridiculous narrative that Jews supported the Binduri Junta. Well, sorry, the Binduri Junta is in Kiev, not in Donetsk. So you can go check that article out, but that's just one more example of the propaganda that's being spread all across the world in regards to the Ukrainian situation. We've also seen the push. We had the visit by Brennan and then by Biden that come in to Kiev, and then we suddenly see a military assault being launched on eastern Ukraine. Well, what a coincidence. What a coincidence, right? So this is clear that Brennan was involved in the sharing of some intelligence, in the encouragement to go for the Ukrainian military proper, the Kiev military, I guess you should say, encouraging the Ukrainian military under the command of Turchinov and Yatsenyuk to go launch an attack on eastern Ukraine, and that fell apart. The soldiers went to eastern Ukraine and surrendered. They don't want to fight for central bankers. They don't want to fight for oligarchs. They don't want to fight for IMF austerity. We're going to say more about IMF austerity if we get a chance later. But they don't want to fight for these people. Biden goes over and runs his big fat mouth, his flappy, ignorant mouth, and gets nothing done, right? There are assaults that were launched in eastern Ukraine, some of them successful, but the overwhelming majority of them stalemates or failures. So we are seeing unpleasant developments, of course, with the NATO troop deployments. Now we have NATO troop deployments in Belarus, and I think it's Lithuania and Poland. NATO troops, predominantly American troops, of course, because everybody is always ready to fight to the last American. Unfortunately, Americans are also willing to fight to the last American, no matter how stupid the cause. But the British and the French, never to fall too far behind in imperialism, have also committed troops as well. Some Air Force contingents have been strategically placed in Eastern Europe as a part of NATO. So we have that situation developing as well. Of course, the pro-Russian militants in eastern Ukraine receiving support from Putin. Obviously, it's clear that the Russian intelligence agencies and Russian government does have something to do with this sort of counter destabilization. We finally reached the point now we have a counter color revolution, but that sentiment in eastern Ukraine of being pro-Russian does exist. It is very real. So this is a situation that we continue to monitor. Now let's look at Syria. Let's look at Assad. Right? We have this article that I had posted on April the 23rd. Again, this show is pre-recorded about a week in advance, so whatever information you're getting from me at this point is a week old. But again, compare that to what you get to the mainstream media, and you'll see a bit of a headway in my favor. And unfortunately, the alternative media falling behind as much as it's able to do. Some of the information that you'll hear on this show is going to be a little bit ahead of that as well. So, not to toot my own horn here, but toot, I guess. West blames Assad for chemical weapons attack again. This is the article that I wrote for Activist Post regarding the gas attack in Kfar Zeta. This is yet another chemical weapons attack that has prompted the Anglo-European propaganda machine to grease up its gears to accuse Bashar al-Assad of crimes against humanity, justify some form of humanitarian intervention in Syria by NATO again. And the attacks came shortly before the completion of the transfer and destruction of Syria's chemical weapons stockpiles. So this is still ongoing. We're still watching as the last bit of chemical weapons are destroyed. But it's pretty predictable, right? We have the recent attacks being promoted by Western outlets as an example of how even a chemical weapons-free Syria is still capable of deploying chemical weapons attacks against civilians, and they claim that this is the case because of a loophole in the chemical weapons agreement that allows for the production of chlorine gas. We had State Department spokeswoman Jen Psaki, or Sucky, has already seized upon the reports, having and she stated, this is a direct quote here, "We have indications of the use of a toxic industrial chemical, probably chlorine, in Syria this month in the opposition-dominated village of Kfar Zeta. We're examining allegations that the government was responsible. We take all allegations of the use of chemicals and combat use very seriously, end quote. But of course, that statement, while it was somewhat tepid compared to the ridiculous propaganda that usually comes out of the State Department, was clearly an attempt to blame the Assad government. It's what's being ignored, of course, by these outlets is not only the possibility but the high probability that the Syrian government was not responsible for the chlorine gas attacks, and it was the death squads who were responsible for this. Now, I'll give you a few reasons. The first reason is take a look at the chemical weapons attack in Ghouta, right? It was foolish then for Assad to launch a chemical weapons attack because he was winning, and because there was so much attention regarding chemical weapons already focused on Syria. If it was foolish for him to use those weapons in Ghouta in August, how much more foolish would it be for him to use those chemical weapons in April of 2014, when he was winning even more so, where the country has largely broken up the death squad organizations? Is Assad, who is known for being clever and crafty, is he so incompetent as to put himself in the same position? Of course, Assad didn't put himself in that position to begin with any of the chemical weapons attacks, because there's no evidence whatsoever that Assad was responsible for them. So, if that attack also, you also got to think about this, if that attack drew Syria to the brink of war with the U.S. and NATO back then, why would Assad use those chemical weapons now and put himself back on the track to war with the West? Again, why would he use these weapons if he was winning? Why would he use them if he was winning even greater battles now than he was in Ghouta? So this makes this idea pretty implausible. Now, another reason you have to question this is because, despite the fact that corporate media outlets like Time and ABC are confident that Assad is the most likely culprit, there's no evidence for this. Right? Produce your evidence and we'll see. The entirety of the evidence that's cited by these mainstream outlets revolve around information that's provided by activists. Remember, we've talked about this before on this program. Activists say. That transfers to mean death squads say, right? Activists equal death squads. So they're getting this information from activists, meaning death squads. They're also getting information from pro-death squad NGOs, non-governmental organizations, and so forth. So definitely not impartial observers to get this information. We have videos that were uploaded by the death squads that showed footage of civilians who were suffering from what appears to be the inhalation of toxic gas, as well as one boy who allegedly died from the chemicals. But none of this footage, it's being presented in the articles that you read by the mainstream media as the proof, the evidence. Well, none of it shows anything incriminating the Assad government. It doesn't really show anything incriminating anyone. It's just footage of people choking on gas. Now, lastly, you got to point out that the most important fact surrounding these recent chemical attacks is that the history of the death squads. The death squads have used chemical weapons repeatedly. In fact, they've used chlorine-based chemical weapons repeatedly as well. Remember, March 2013. There was Khan al-Assal. That was a chemical weapons deployment there by the death squads. And in that chemical weapons deployment, they used chlorine gas. In fact, you can read an article by Alex Thompson of The Telegraph that explains the likelihood of the culprits being the death squads being vastly higher than that of the government. And we won't go into that into too much detail, but essentially the chemical, the chlorine-based chemical, was known as CL17, which is easily available as a swimming pool cleaner, and the insurgents in Iraq have used this type of chemical weapon on numerous occasions as well. So this article, this Alex Thompson article, also points out that it generally only produces limited casualties, um, and this type of chemical would not typically be one that was used by an army, especially one seeking mass casualties. So that's important to bear in mind as well. In December 2012, the death squads, remember, captured a chlorine factory inside Syria. In fact, the Syrian government actually issued a warning that the death squads might attempt to use chemical weapons of this type in an attempt to overthrow and oppress the people of Syria. In fact, you can read that. That was reported on by Press TV and a few alternative media outlets, but not by the mainstream. So we have that to look at in terms of Syria. But overall, it appears that Assad marches forward in his attempt to squash the death squads, and my hopes are that he does just that. Now, since we're talking about Syria, we can move on to the Middle East, and I can announce that I have on April 29th concluded my series of the history and science of color revolutions with part 4, the final installment of that series, up at Activist Post, and you can check that article out. That's up there now. And the series, the first 3 parts, had dealt mainly with Eastern Europe in terms of color revolutions and how they work, where they came from, the science of them, the methodology of them, and so forth. And those articles, I believe, are pretty important if you want to understand how the color revolution system works. So I would encourage you to go find those articles, the history and science of color revolutions, part 1, 2, 3, and 4, and read them, and you should be able to understand how these things work, and hopefully be impervious to them when they happen overseas or when they happen here in the United States, so we don't fall prey to a trap. But as I said, the first 3 parts of the articles deal more with the Eastern European and Slavic nations in terms of color revolutions, but it's important to remember that not just Eastern European and Slavic nations are easily manipulated using this methodology. We also have Middle Eastern nations being targets of this Anglo-European destabilization tactic as well. We also have that happening in South America, Central America, Asia, and even Russia. So, for one aspect of this you have to look at is the Arab Spring, for instance. The Arab Spring has been well established to be nothing more than a Western-backed color revolution. Now, despite how good it makes people feel to see protesters in Egypt and Tunisia and other countries, Libya, out in the streets against an oppressive government, at the same time, you have to realize that this was all instigated by the Anglo-Europeans. The Anglo-Americans specifically had a bigger hand in that, but the Anglo-European network. And until you understand that the Arab Spring was a color revolution, unfortunately you're going to be left in the dark in terms of the incidents that are taking place in Egypt right now, for instance. So please do some research on that. In fact, there's a good article up on the nature of the Arab Spring by Sam Muho, and it's entitled Color Revolutions, Getting Our Facts Straight on the Arab Spring, which is up at Global Research. And it's a pretty detailed article, and I encourage people to read that and take a look at the Arab Spring after you read that. So, give me a second here to scroll up to the other part of my notes here that I've got typed up. So we have Tony Cartalucci and Niall Bowie have a book entitled War on Syria, Gateway to World War III. It's an ebook and it's free. You can just Google that, but I linked to it in my article as well. And I want to read part of their book here to kind of set the stage for what I'm about to say about the Arab Spring and the color revolution aspect taking place in the Middle East. It says, One of the organizations involved in recruiting, training, and supporting youth activists ahead of the Arab Spring was described in an April 2011 New York Times article. The organization, Movements.org, or Alliance of Youth Movements, would later be described admitting to U.S. funding and involvement in the Arab Spring uprisings. The article implicates Freedom House, National Endowment for Democracy, and two of its satellite organizations, the International Republican Institute and National Democratic Institute, in recruiting, training, and supporting the unrest starting as early as 2008. While the New York Times article doesn't mention the organization by name, it links to an official U.S. State Department announcement titled Announcement on Alliance of Youth Movement Summit that most certainly does. The Alliance of Youth Movements is a corporate-sponsored coup college of sorts, training activists to subvert and topple governments on the U.S. State Department's behalf. Now, if you've read my series or if you've heard this show repeatedly, you'll recognize some of these organizations: the International Republican Institute, the National Democratic Institute, Freedom House, National Endowment for Democracy. All these organizations are indeed nothing but color revolution, coup, destabilization organizations that exist for the purpose of destabilizing governments, overthrowing governments, and providing the types of change that the offending nation would like to see. Now, we're going to take a break right now for station identification. Stay with us, and we're going to continue talking about this when we come back.
Urgent action was necessary. Decisive measures were taken by Ukraine, and decisive measures have just been taken by the IMF. So there has been a very strong endorsement for the program, which will release over the course of the next 2 years $17.1 billion in different installments over the course of those 2 years.
Those war of words continue between two old foes as the U.S. imposes new sanctions on Russia over its actions in Ukraine. Meanwhile, President Obama has been criticized for not doing enough. But foreign policy is often driven by public opinion. So, what's America's take? It turns out over half of Americans support amping up those sanctions against Russia. That's according to a new survey by the Pew Research Center and USA Today. But maybe the buck stops there. Only a third think it'd be a good idea to send arms and military supplies to Ukraine. Now, ultimately, that may be President Obama's call, and his grades through all this are only so-so. Just 4 in 10 Americans think his handling of the crisis has been about right. Regardless of who does what and how, do Americans think it matters? Well, not really. Only about a third of the country thinks what happens between Russia and Ukraine is very important to the U.S. Which sort of makes sense if we take a look at a survey published by the Washington Post a few weeks ago. Political scientists found that only 1 in 6 Americans could actually find Ukraine on a map. The median response was about 2,900 kilometers off. The survey actually found that the less accurate a person was about Ukraine's location, the more they wanted the U.S. military to get involved. David Botti, BBC News, Washington.
Moscow vehemently condemns the inaction of Western countries towards the unrest in Ukraine, with President Putin pulling no punches against authorities in Kiev as well. Let's get now more from our teaser, Igor Piskunov, joining us live. Igor, so how did the Russian president react to all of this that's happening out in Odessa?
Well, the president lashed out at the current authorities in Kiev, largely blaming them for the violence in southeastern Ukraine, also adding through his press secretary that whoever supports them as legitimate authorities of Ukraine are criminals themselves. Also know that Mr. Putin is closely monitoring the situation there in southeast of the country, and isn't only deeply concerned about the situation itself, but also about how it's being perceived in the West. Mr. Peskov said that how could Western nations be talking about any sort of democratic elections there in Ukraine amid this ongoing military operation in the southeast of the country against their critics, against protesters. And also, they said that there's no way that these people are now going to put their weapons down with this type of violence being presented against them, including, of course, the latest events, troubling events in Odessa. And also, we know that the president says that the West either doesn't understand what's happening in the southeast of the country or doesn't want to understand the situation on purpose.
Archie's Igor Piskunov there live for us from Moscow, giving us what the president's reaction is to the situation in Odessa.
Gunshots in the eastern Ukrainian city of Slavyansk on Sunday. Armed pro-Russian separatists control the center of town, and government forces have taken positions at checkpoints around the city.
We're traveling from Kharkiv. There is shooting going on, so we are waiting here.
Slavyansk is a rebel stronghold. It's not just government troops they're prepared to fight. It's also the ultra-radical opposition group called the Right Sector.
I know a lot of people here are looking forward to seeing those, how do you call them? The Right Sector. Let them come to us.
The crisis in Ukraine has spread beyond the restive east. Overnight, this bank headquarters was set ablaze in the southeastern city of Mariupol. And in the southern city of Odessa, residents mourn the dead after Friday clashes left more than 40 dead. Ukrainian Prime Minister Arseniy Yatsenyuk came to Odessa on Sunday and accused Russia of engineering the riots that killed so many here.
Destruction of the country and splitting the country. This is the Russian plan. Odessa was holding on for 2 months until the Russians sent here more people to heat up the situation. Odessa is far too valuable for Russia, but it is even more valuable for us because it's our Odessa, our country, and our people.
But calm didn't return to Odessa on Sunday. Hundreds of pro-Russian activists attacked a police station and demanded the release of their comrades detained in Friday's riots. Some 30 of them were released, and questions are now being raised about the army's ability, as well as the police, to confront the uprising in their country.
The Ukraine government reportedly sent an elite National Guard unit to reestablish control in the southern port city of Odessa. The twin moves reflected an apparent escalation of efforts to bring the region back under Kiev's control.
For more news, visit youtube.com/pigmine5.
This is Ozzy Skateboard, and you're listening to UCY.tv.
And welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to Truth on the Tracks. I'm Brandon Turbeville. For those of you who are just joining us after the break, I'd like to remind you that you can catch Truth on the Tracks here every Monday night and Friday night at 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time here on UCY.tv. Now, before the break, we were discussing color revolutions and how they also work in the Middle East as opposed to simply the Eastern European nations. Of course, these things are used all across the world. I highly encourage you to go to read my previous articles on this topic, the History and Science of Color Revolutions, Part 1, 2, 3, and 4, in order to understand the methodology that is used to employ these color revolutions, the history of these color revolutions. It really is a science, and it really is not something that was created just over recent years. So I'd also like to encourage you to check out my book, The Road to Damascus, The Anglo-American Assault on Syria, which explains how these things work as well, and of course the work of Tony Cartolucci at Land Destroyer Report and Webster Tarpley's Obama, the Postmodern Coup, and of course, Color Revolutions and Geopolitics.blogspot.com is a good website as well. So, just some avenues for further research on color revolutions and how they operate. But again, I would remind you to start with my series, The History and Science of Color Revolutions, Part 1, 2, 3, and 4. Now, again, we were talking about this before the break, and I mentioned a New York Times article which mentioned the role of NGOs in the Arab Spring, but of course it tried to obfuscate the role of NGOs in the Arab Spring, and it didn't reveal the extent to which these NGOs were responsible for it. It is surprisingly open regarding the role played by Western NGOs in the movement, but not to the extent that that I would like. But still, the author of that article, Ron Nixon, actually goes through some of these aspects here, and it says that it talks about the youth movement in Egypt, and he talks about the Bahrain Center for Human Rights in Bahrain. It talks about what he calls a grassroots activist like Insar Qadi, who is a youth leader in Yemen, who received training and financing from groups like International Republican Institute and the National Democratic Institute and Freedom House. And this was actually released by WikiLeaks, of all places. But this article does go into these things, and it admits that the National Endowment for Democracy was set up in 1983 to do what the CIA wanted to do, or had been doing covertly, that the NED was created to do it overtly, and they had about $100 million annually from Congress to do that. So people who read my article would, and my series of articles, would recognize that immediately. But this is what Nixon writes in regards to the Arab Spring. He says, some Egyptian youth leaders attended a 2008 technology meeting in New York where they were taught to use social networking and mobile technologies to promote democracy. Among those sponsoring the meeting were Facebook, Google, MTV, Columbia Law School, and the State Department. We learned how to organize and build coalitions, said Bashim Fathi, a founder of the youth movement that ultimately drove the Egyptian uprisings. Mr. Fathi, who attended training with Freedom House, said this certainly helped during the revolution. Ms. Qadi, the Yemeni youth activist, attended American training sessions in Yemen. It helped me very much because I used to think that change only takes place by force and by weapons, she said. But by now, she said, it is clear that the results can be achieved with peaceful protest and other nonviolent means. End quote. So, again, that's something else to point out. If you look back at some of my previous articles and look at the work of Gene Sharp, who used nonviolence as a form of warfare, you'll see that that plays right into the agenda and right into the methodology of color revolutions. Now, we also had the diplomatic cables that were released, that were intercepted, where it showed that Egyptian governments, including the Bahraini governments, were worried about the American involvement in their countries. Bahrain, the officials there worried that the group's political training disproportionately benefited the opposition to the incumbent government. In Yemen, also the government there complained to the American embassy and so forth that the American efforts to promote democracy, and I put democracy in scare quotes, amounted to interference in Yemeni affairs internally, and of course it was. And there, of course, was intense opposition to the American groups in Egypt. Egypt, of course, at the time received about $1.5 billion in military and economic aid from the U.S., and there was a lot of back and forth in this regard because of the money that Egypt received. Egypt did not necessarily want to bite the hand that fed it, but it also, in terms of Hosni Mubarak, they did not want to give up power and cede it to pro-Western or overly pro-Western forces. Mubarak himself was pretty skeptical of the U.S. role in what was going on in Egypt. And in fact, Mubarak had put himself on a hit list with the United States some time ago. So sometime before that situation began, the Arab Spring. So the Republican and Democratic institutes, the IRI and the NDI, were actually the biggest flies in the ointment for the Egyptian government. In fact, Gamal Mubarak, who was the son of Hosni Mubarak, wrote in a cable back in 2008, a governmental cable, that he was, quote, irritable about direct U.S. democracy and government's funding of Egyptian NGOs. So the Egyptian government actually appealed to these groups to stop. But of course, as is clear, you can't just appeal to these groups to stop, because they won't, and you have to deal with them. And that is precisely why the new government, the Egyptian government, after they overthrew, actually before Morsi, when the military took over, then it was after Mubarak fell, many of these groups were rounded up and arrested or deported or simply shut down. And when Morsi took over, of course, Morsi heavily involved with the Muslim Brotherhood, these groups were not so much restrained as they would have been otherwise. And of course now the government of Sisi, General Sisi, this is something entirely different from Morsi. So again, before we get too deep into that conversation, I just want to encourage you to read that series of articles and see what you can learn from that. So on to Rand Paul. So we talked about color revolutions and the deception of color revolutions. So let's talk about deception some more. Let's talk about Rand Paul. And unfortunately, a lot of my libertarian and anarchist friends, more so the libertarians, because anarchists tend to not really vote for anybody, but more so the libertarians, support this idiot, this scumbag, this neocon in, God, what do you call him? Neocon in Republican clothing? Certainly, at best, he's a Republican in libertarian clothing, but this is what, this is what Rand Paul is. He's an absolute fraud. And again, unfortunately, there seems to be this split with even in the libertarian, because everybody has their own clique, right? And it goes from the people who legitimately want more freedom and liberty in their personal lives and so forth, to people who are simply just slimy businessmen who've latched on to this dumb Austrian school theory, and they see the libertarian, not so much party, but the libertarian outlook and contingent and sentiment as something that they could piggyback on. But what's Rand Paul done lately? And I've got an article up on the Anti-Media called "Rand Paul Endorses Another Establishment Republican, Nothing for Liberty Democrat." Now, this was originally reported by Ben Swann over at benswann.com, and this regards an endorsement that Paul made of the Senator Susan Collins. I believe this is her name, Susan Collins in Maine, a Republican, establishment Republican hack. And Paul went to the stage at the Portland Herald Press, where he was going to formally endorse Collins, and he stated, quote, "I wholeheartedly endorse Senator Collins for re-election. I think she is doing a great job for Maine and for the country." Now, when Paul was asked about Collins' stance on the NSA scandal, he stated, quote, "I don't really know exactly what her position is on the NSA. You'd have to ask her about that," end quote. Well, before I go any further, I want to say, if you're going to endorse somebody for Congress, how could you not know what their position is on the NSA scandal, especially when you're such a principled guy that you have to stand up and speak out against the NSA at every opportunity? But he doesn't even know her position. You'd have to ask her about that. Well, why didn't you ask her about that? Because you're going to be the guy endorsing her, right? Well, Paul apparently was incapable of doing even the basic 20 minutes of research that would have resulted in the information that he didn't know. Ben Swann, those guys over there, did that for him. And here's what it turns out. Susan Collins voted yes on extending the Patriot Act and roving wiretaps in 2011. She voted no on requiring a FISA court warrant to monitor U.S. to foreign calls in 2008. She voted yes on removing need for FISA warrants on wiretapping abroad in 2007. She voted no on preserving habeas corpus for Guantanamo detainees, 2006. She voted no on requiring CIA reports on detainees and interrogation methods, 2006. She voted yes on reauthorizing the Patriot Act in March 2006. She voted yes on extending the Patriot Act to the wiretap provisions in 2005. So this woman is an absolute piece of crap. Anybody who voted for the Patriot Act, for whatever reason, is a piece of crap and should never be trusted with any type of authority. That should be a litmus test. Now, Ben Swan asks, this is the question he asked in his article, why would Senator Rand Paul, who is building his campaign largely on the issue of NSA spying and the restoration of constitutional rights and civil liberties, would say Susan Collins is doing a great job for Maine and the country? I agree, Ben. I asked the same question. But I have an answer to that, and that is that Paul really doesn't give a damn about constitutional rights and civil liberties. He doesn't really give a damn about the Constitution. What Rand Paul cares about is Rand Paul. And, we have this Democratic candidate, Sheena Bellows, who has a much better stance on those issues than Collins. Bellows opposes those policies. She believes that Snowden is a hero. Now, I think Snowden is something else, but if he really is a whistleblower, then obviously he should be protected. And Bellows also believes that the Whistleblower Protection Act should be amended to include government contractors. So much more in line with Little Rand's stated policies than otherwise would be apparent. In fact, I tend to believe, from what I've seen of Sheena Bellows, that she would actually be more in common with some of the libertarian issues, even though she's a Democrat, than Susan Collins. But she was ignored. She was not endorsed by Paul. It was Susan Collins, the Patriot Act queen. You can read some of Bellows' positions and the quotes that she's made in regards to her positions in my article up at Anti-Media, but I won't really go into those because we only have a few minutes left. Now, this isn't the first time Rand has endorsed an establishment Republican over another candidate that seems to embody the more liberty-based principles that most libertarians espouse. Remember, in 2013, Little Rand endorsed Mitch McConnell over David Adams, who was more of a Tea Party candidate that more libertarians tended to support. 2012, the most treacherous act was that Little Rand endorsed Mitt Romney over his own father, Ron Paul. So let's not forget that. And I'm sorry, it's not just an oversight on Rand's part in regards to Collins' record. That is clear for all to see. Her record is clear for all to see. Rand is supposed to be the brains, right? He's the guy who really has a philosophy, a really core philosophy about economics and civil rights and civil liberties and constitutional rights. Well, if he's that smart, then I don't think you can attribute his idiocy to his idiocy in terms of his endorsements to simple ignorance. This is more than that. It's clearly an agenda here. Now, still on Rand Paul, there's an article, theantimedia.org. I wrote this. It's entitled "Rand Paul Proposes Bill to Cut Aid to Palestinians." So this is, anybody has any questions about where this guy, where his allegiance lies, if anybody questions whether or not he pledges his fealty and loyalty to the settler state of Israel, then read this article, right? Because Paul recently announced that he plans to introduce a new bill that would suspend U.S. aid to the Palestinians until the Palestinian authorities publicly recognize Israel's right to exist and declare a ceasefire with Israel. So, not the even-handed remove funding from everybody position that he had before that alarmed so many Zionists. No, this is removing the funding to the Palestinians, but not Israel. So if Paul's bill passes, it would allow the Palestinian leaders 5 weeks to publicly declare Israel's right to exist, as well as for them to initiate and declare a ceasefire between the Palestinians and Israel. And if they don't, then the authorities would comply them, or the U.S. would require them to forfeit the $400 million in aid, or in other words, it would cut off the $400 million in aid that's provided to the Palestinians by the U.S. Every year. So the bill largely is seen as a reaction to the recent reconciliation between Fatah and Hamas, led by the President Mahmoud Abbas, and Fatah is led by Palestinian President Abbas, and Hamas is largely more of an Islamist organization that's in charge of the Gaza Strip. I got my notes out of order there and threw myself off. But Paul's statement regarding the bill, Rand Paul says, Israel cannot be expected to negotiate with an entity that does not believe it should exist and has used terrorist tactics to seek its end. End quote. But apparently the Palestinians can be expected to negotiate with someone that doesn't think they should exist, and they should be expected to negotiate with a group that's used terrorist tactics to seek its end, because that's the history of Israel, is that it was Jewish terrorists that used terrorism to seek their own ends and establish the settler state and throw the people who had a rightful claim to the land off of it. So I guess once again we have Rand Paul's principles being set in stone, except when they apply to the people that he likes. So one more quote from Rand Paul. Back in 2013, he went to Israel to grovel to the Israelis, and he was asked by Breitbart News about whether or not he believes the United States should stand with Israel. And this is what he said. He says, absolutely we stand with Israel. What I think we should do is announce to the world, and I think it is pretty well known, that any attack on Israel will be treated as an attack on the United States. Well, there you go. Rand Paul also pledging his fealty to Israel. So I really wish I could have gotten into some of the other topics that I wanted to get into in regards to the unfortunate plight of the alternative media and the activist community, who are falling for every trick in the book, for every scam, whether it's the Bundy Ranch, the Bitcoin garbage, Little Rand, the Austrian school. All of this stuff is nothing but a trap, and it's designed to lead you off of the right path. And it's successful. It's done pretty well. So you got to get away from this stuff, and hopefully in the next week or so I'll actually get to sit down on this show and go through some of this stuff and try my best to show you how you've been coerced and conned into supporting these various tools and diversion. So let me talk a little bit about, in the remaining time that we have here, which is only about 5 minutes or so, about some of the traps that have been laid for the alternative media and the activist community, specifically the libertarian and anarchist community. And this has worked to a T. Right now, I just went through Rand Paul, and I'm going to say a lot more about Rand Paul in the future. If anybody still believes that this scumbag is on their side, but that's neither here nor there. The question of Rand Paul, of Cliven Bundy, Bitcoin, the Austrian school, all of this stuff has led libertarians and anarchists particularly, but many other activists and so forth, down the path to absolute destruction, especially in terms of philosophy and ideology and what they can produce and provide for the real world, for their fellow human beings themselves. Let's take a brief look at Rand Paul. Rand Paul has led many of the libertarians who were initially Ron Paul supporters, especially people who believe in this idiotic Austrian school economics system and so forth. He's led them off to the Republican Party. You are now, if you support Rand Paul, you're a Republican. Congratulations. You're not a libertarian. You're certainly not an anarchist. You're a Republican. Congratulations for that. Cliven Bundy, he didn't take that group of libertarians. He took the group of people who were tired of government overreach, who were tired of government land grabs, tired of oppressive, invasive government. They were tired of having their Second Amendment rights violated. They were tired of all this stuff. The militias and Second Amendment activists and so forth, who were primed to make a stand. They took these individuals and put them on the front lines in front of a con man, Cliven Bundy, and is now leading them off like a Pied Piper off into the sunset, where they will be no good for anybody. They've allowed themselves to walk into a trap and be demonized in terms of public relations and so forth yet again. We have Bitcoin. I've heard for years many libertarians and anarchists and so forth even they've talked about the dangers of a cashless society. And what happened? Bitcoin comes out, and under the Austrian school, the anarcho ideology of bad government. The worst thing in the world is government. They've created Bitcoin. They hate money that's created out of thin air. That's why the Federal Reserve is evil. So what do? They create something that was created out of thin air, a monetary system out of thin air. What do? They're scared of a cashless society, so they create a cashless currency. And not all, but many of the anarchists and libertarians fall right into line. So you've got that group of individuals being led off into the sunset. The Austrian school economics, which is absolutely funded by the Rockefellers, by Wall Street, by the New World Order. It's funded, but it sounds good. It sounds like it might work in practice, and of course, it only looks like a horrible plan when you actually pay attention to it. So you've got that group of individuals who are latching on to this economic theory that is absolutely bogus and wrong. And you look at libertarians and anarchists who are unfortunately fighting to cut their own throat. At every opportunity, they will cut their own throat economically, in terms of genetically modified foods, in terms of the legalization of marijuana. You can always count on especially the anarchists to cut their own throats. Well, it's time you wake up. It's time you quit following the Rand Pauls and the Cloven Bundys and the Bitcoin and the Austrian school and von Hayek and von Mises and all these characters. It's time you start thinking for yourself, using the thinking part of your brain. And it's time to get this show on the road, because you got to quit being led into traps. And it looks like we're out of time. And of course, I'm gonna talk about this more in the future. So stick with me, ladies and gentlemen. Again, this is Truth on the Tracks. I'm Brandon Turbeville. We'll see you next week.
But once again, in Ukraine, there are two competing versions of the truth. Ukrainian officials say Russian citizens and former members of the country's deposed government were responsible for all this. Odessa is a city with rich historic and cultural links to Russia. There have been disturbances here in recent weeks, but nothing like this. This isn't like Ukraine's east. These people are a long way from the Russian border. The flames of political and cultural hatred now burn strongly here as well. Fury, confusion, grief. Witnesses say there were hundreds inside when it caught fire. It's unclear how the fire started.
For more news, visit youtube.com/pigmine5.
This is Ozzy Skateboard, and you're listening to UCY.tv.